right. Welcome to The Porch, a podcast filmed and scripted by our wonderful Umoja Narco College students. We just want to invite you to pull a seat to the porch, grab your coffee, tea, sparkling water, or whatever, and just come by with us. This podcast was made possible through the RCCD Foundation as well as the Century Circle Grants and ANCC. With that being said, enjoy.
Hi, welcome to episode 1 of The Porch. My name is Lexi Jones. I'm a history major and I'm currently in my second year.
My name is Audre Turner. I'm a chemistry major and I'm still in my first year.
Hi, my name is Luis Corona. I'm a psychology major and this is my first year.
Hi, my name is Devin Woolridge. I'm a first year here and I'm a history major. Our book was on Poetry is Not a Luxury by Audre Lorde. A little bit about Audre Lorde is that she was born in February 18th, 1934 in New York and went on to become a leading African-American poet who would give voices to issues of race, gender, and sexuality. Throughout her poetry and other writings, she tackled topics that were important to her as a woman, of color, and being lesbian and a mother and a feminist. Most of her writings would be published and be released in the midst of a second wave of feminism during the early 1960s. And in this particular reading, Audre Lorde's Poetry is Not a Luxury seeks to define poetry as something vital and necessary to the people, especially ethnic groups and women, rather than a leisure activity that's typically associated with poetry. And one of her main topics is feminism.
Yeah, so one of the quotes that I found very interesting from Poetry is Not a Luxury was, feelings were meant to kneel to thought as we were meant to kneel to men. But women have survived as poets, and there are no new pains. We have felt them all already. So for me, that one really stood out the most just because she is a big feminist.
No, because that's a really big thing is like understanding that Audre Lorde not only was a feminist, but she was also a big activist for gay rights as well. And understanding the power that comes with being a woman that's rather like put down by society.
Yeah, definitely. And also in society, men are viewed as more powerful and women are viewed as less than. So that's another reason why the quote kind of stood out to me.
It's kind of a good segue into like actually talking about like the whole like the essay as a whole of how she was talking about. So the kind of gist of it is that she explains that poetry is not a luxury because it allows the distant thoughts that may be seen as like rebellious or against the actual culture built up. And women can use poetry to express those thoughts, to show, without really, what's the word I'm looking for? Without offending too many people. It's like, oh, it's just a poem. But like in reality, it's really gathering people around, kind of uniting them to actually start bigger things like protests and whatnot.
Yeah, we see a lot in her text that she goes into like the whole feminist and everything being oppressed for so long. And we can see a lot, especially in this quote where she says, "These places of possibility within ourselves are dark because they are ancient and hidden. They have survived and grown through the darkness. Within these deep places, each of us holds an incredible reserve of creativity and power, of unexamined, unrecorded emotion and feeling. This woman's place of power within each one of us is neither white nor surface. It is dark, it is ancient, and it is deep." And when I heard that, I really thought, looking back into culture, so I thought of the story of Lilith, which is the first wife of Adam, who was banished to hell because she wasn't confined to what they wanted to do. So that's why out of Adam they created Eve. So pretty much I wanted to go into how she really wasn't as bad as they say. She was just setting her own boundaries in a way.
Yeah, and I think especially back then at the time, women were, like you said, and obviously like her poem reads, women were oppressed.
Yeah.
So poetry was her way of having that outlet. I think even now, like with everything going on, like things have changed, but not really.
Yeah.
I think...
You go.
I was going to say, I think what mostly changed, like, in today's, like, kind of standards, I mean, back then, this was, like, the 80s, but now you're starting to realize, like, poetry kind of takes expression in a lot of different forms nowadays, especially, like, with music. You kind of sit down and actually start listening to lyrics, and you're like, oh, gosh,
Yeah.
Like, they have a lot deeper meaning than what you
Well, yeah,
thought.
like, even, like, for example, like we were talking about how music, like, J. Cole, big J. Cole fan here, she's mine part one, part two. Like, he's over here glorifying women. Usually back in those days, like back when like people are very religious, women are treated as an object, as a trophy to the man. And like when you have popular artists or you have people who through music and through poetry come out and glorify women and the strength that they do to carry a child, or the strength that they carry themselves, knowing that society doesn't help them enough, or that especially when it comes to black women, in the case of Audre Lorde, that black women are possibly the most oppressed group in America,
100%.
because not only are they black and dealing with all the racist issues that come with that, but they're also women, and that's another layer of like those problems of being in that minority.
I also feel, I saw a tweet not too long ago, like maybe last week, and it was this black lady, and she was basically saying how whenever something goes wrong in the black community, white people always will blame the mother. So that's also, like, I don't know if that ties in too much, but I found that interesting because it's very true, like, how black women are oppressed.
Yeah.
So the blame always goes back on them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel that, and I feel like Audre Lorde does a great job of at least like not show, like, because it's a very unspoken thing in the black community for the black women to rise up. But Audre Lorde, at least throughout this poem, talks about the strength that's underlying, that's hidden in that darkness. Because like he was talking about with like that story of Lilith wasn't a bad person per se, and they deemed her as like the mother of demons.
Yeah, the mother.
But all she really did was being independent, being her own woman, and apparently that was frowned upon. But necessarily now looking back at it, you're like, that's not a bad thing. You guys wanted an Eve, which was more subordinate to Adam, instead of a woman that's more independent, that's more like, that's stronger, I guess, in a sense.
And okay. And just to bring up something more about like how independent women are, Audrey actually says something about that here. She says in page 645, she says, "For living within structures defined by profit, by linear power, institutional dehumanization, our feelings were not meant to survive. Kept around thought as women were expected to kneel to men." And that kind of reveals kind of something about the patriarchy that she was talking about, because, you know, through all that time, you know, women were only really seen as like objects to be used as a means to the end for like male dominance. And by going through that generational torment over and over again, Audrey really kind of like shows like, hey, you know, poetry is this way I can actually use as an outlet, so we can start, you know, getting together and figuring it out. And even now, that's still, you know, a really big thing.
Yeah.
Like, it really shows, like, back to that story, like you're saying, that because Adam was made out of Eve, it shows that they wanted the culture to follow along to being, as women being submissive, you know? So not really giving women a chance to be their own identity, but just a trophy to whatever man who had her at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, like, as, like, a woman, I feel like that's still, like, is something that goes on now. Like, you look at, like, the laws that they're trying to do to regulate women's bodies.
Yeah. And I mean, when I look at that quote, for example, like when I see that word, those two words, institutional dehumanization, it instantly like makes me think back to like the way that not just black women, but also black people as a whole have been dehumanized, desensitized to violence, to trauma, and how that trauma is kind of carried on into now. And like for example, like when slavery was happening, like the way that they would treat black women, it was just sex. Like they would literally model them and just be like, look, you can have this, you know. And the younger women were always more expensive because you could as I would say, breed more, have more kids, and it was just a very like sickening thing. But that type of trauma has still resonated with the black community, and still seeing that today, and how over-sexualized black women are, and then how they're like mistreated even after that.
Yeah.
When I read this one quote within the essay, it's her the seventh paragraph. "But as we become more in touch with our own ancient black non-European view of living as a situation to be experienced and interacted with, we learn more and more to cherish our feelings and to respect those hidden sources of our power from where true knowledge and therefore lasting action comes." And this quote this quote was like super deep in like so many different levels, because at least when you look back, because one thing that she always brings about in her poetry is like that self-reflection in the people. And so when reading this as somebody that's also Black and Hispanic, I also think about my own family and how, like, in typical European view, you're always thought to, like, be chasing after money and chasing after success. And, like, most of the time, you don't see the family side of that. But at least with the household I've grown up in, like, family is such a big thing, whether that be on my Hispanic side or my Black side. Our families are very, like, conjoined and very, like, close. And, like, even now, like a big thing that goes on in the Black community is, like, calling each other cousin. And, like, it's just integrating family, even though we might not be, like, literally by blood
That's
cousins.
still, like, your
it's
family.
still, like, yeah, like that, like, cousin, like, you're my family, we're, like, close. And with that is a sense of power, because that unity in it itself is power in that sense.
And I think even, like, now, like, unity is such, like, a big thing because we were oppressed for so long.
Yeah.
So now to have, like, other people where it's, like, you can stand up together, I feel like that's a very powerful thing.
And the thing is, when you compare that to like that post-colonial modernism, you kind of realize it may be more of like an American thing to be more independent, more on your own. You know, that pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality, doing everything on your own, getting your own money, while being corrupted by that kind of mentality. Us Black people as a whole, we've forgotten, like, we have to bring ourselves up with our families and stuff. And I feel like, with that post-colonial modernism, you kind of start, like, thinking and, like, retracting, like, oh, like, this is what we were and this is now what we are now. Like, a lot more independent-oriented.
Yeah.
Like what you said of, like, you have to bring up families. Like, you're not only, like, bringing up yourself at this point, you have to bring up your family members, because you are now the next example, the next step for the next generation. So it's not only hard for you to be what you want to be because of your race, but you have to go through so much more than others have to get where you want to be.
Yeah, like, growing up, and even now, like, my mom has always said, like, you're going to be successful, but don't forget where you came from.
Yeah.
So, like, how you guys are saying, like, you have to make sure you bring your family with you. Like, you can't forget, like, where you started.
Yeah, and I remember, like, that brought me back to the one, like, thing that we have here in Umoja, like, where we talk about if you want to get somewhere fast, go alone, but if you want to go farther, go together. And I feel like that also goes in, like we were talking about, like, at least as a people, we do need to come together, because that unity shows power, because we've been separated for so long, always being, like, always having to fight for our own scraps in a way, and, like, that in it itself is, like, separating the Black community. But now bringing that back and bringing that unity to fight for our own rights, fight for Black women's rights, Black men, fight, and, like, also, like, Latinx and other minority groups as well, is fighting for those rights that we've been denied for so long. And that separation is just another stepping stone that we have to come across in order to fight back against those problems in our communities.
Yeah.
And kind of just using a little bit of a segue here. The thing is, out of everything differently from, like, the rest of Audre Lorde's work, this is actually more structured like an essay. And the thing I found interesting with that was that within all of her other work, she has very interesting, like, breaks in the lines and kind of making you think about those individual words a lot more often. Like, I use the one power as an example, where she says, can I see your book real quick?
Yeah.
Was it the first part?
Yeah, the one right here is where it says, the difference between poetry and rhetoric is being ready to kill yourself instead of your children. And, that kind of, like, making you think individually on every singular passage, it breeds a lot more, like, kind of different ways to interpret it on your own. But with an essay, there's kind of, like, you can always look more deeper into the words, but I feel like with an essay, it's more, like, guided in your thoughts. Yeah. And the way I look at this is more of, like, I feel like she's kind of telling us how we're supposed to be reading her own poetry, like, this is what I'm really trying to say in my poetry. Like, as she says, obviously poetry is not a luxury. She's explaining, like, I'm telling you this stuff because I hope that it breeds unity, and I hope it breeds, like she says, this is not an idle fantasy. She's saying, I don't just put these words out just because I get them off my chest. I want us to, to unite, to grow stronger with everyone and each other, bring ourselves up, not just each other by our own.
Yeah. I definitely see that, because the way she's structured it, it's a more simple structure for her to understand. As like you're saying, like her other poems are like, you have to dig a little to really get the deep understanding of what it is. And as for this one, you can just read along and get the full understanding through each paragraph. So it's like a staircase almost. So you can get one idea from another. So she's really sacrificing, I don't know,
Kind of like artistic
artisticness
qualities.
for easy understandability, because she's really just trying to get the truth and the meaning out there as straight as she can, for all to hear.
Yeah, and to go off of like what Luis and Audie had said, there's a quote within the essay, the short story poem. I think it's either the 10th or the 11th paragraph, and it says, the quote is, "And who asked the question, am I altering your aura, your ideas, your dreams, or am I merely moving you to temporary and reactive action?" And I think that really does play a part, because how Audie said the way she structured the poem was she wants you to know what she's saying, and how Louise had mentioned she's sacrificing her creativity to get her point across. And I think that part of the quote, or that quote, really does like persuade that and push that out there as well.
I think it also kind of like shows her not necessarily disgust, but very big disinterest in kind of like performative activism, like temporary relief. What was it? It said temporary action.
Yeah, temporary and
reactive
reactive action.
And that's kind of it's even bigger in today's like
Very
kind of
very true.
I guess social environment, because there's a lot of performative activists who will see something on the internet and they'll be like, "Oh my God, that's crazy," and then post it a billion times and kind of do nothing while doing too much at the same time.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
when they don't really get anything done, they're like, "Oh, the system's broken," and it's like, well, you didn't use you didn't use any resources, and this is something that's supposed to be uniting people, but instead, once again, going back to that, trying to do everything on your own, instead you have this weird group of people where everyone's thinking differently. No one's really unifying together. There's no Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, or anyone like that. There's just people who kind of like, yeah, we can do that.
Yeah.
But they don't really get anything done or accomplished. And I feel like this poem actually, or I guess you can consider an essay, could be more of a response in that regard, saying like, hey, this is how we're supposed to be using poetry, and I'm not just saying this to say it. And, these aren't just feelings, that I want to take action on this. And maybe that's more of a response to people who criticized her for what she was saying.
Yeah.
From that, I get that, because like there's parts of it where she talks about how it's poetry's always been seen like something playful in a way, and really it's just a beautiful way to express deep emotions that have been suppressed within one. So that's what me and him were talking about before. That was this oppression is really what creates poetry, almost like a gem, because it's so much pressure built onto one person that you would think it would create like negativity and ugly, but it will only create something beautiful, like a gem.
Yeah, and even like to play off that, she mentions poetry in the first paragraph as illumination, so like the light. So the way that I perceive that is like how she says like the illumination, it's shedding light on things that need to be talked about, but necessarily people don't really want to because they're hard topics.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like, at least with Audre Lorde's situation, like being a gay activist, especially in the 60s, where that is not accepted at all. And when being blackness is an issue in itself. Like, she's over here dealing with all of these problems, and like you said, it's oppression, but also it's just the social climate, and not like it's all oppression, yes, but like it's also just all the internal conflicts and all this like systemic conflicts that's going on in her life, and bringing those things to light and illuminating them and bringing them into a product that's more accepted by society as a whole. Because usually when you think poetry, you'll think of like Shakespeare and all that.
Old white
but
men.
like exactly, and that's not typically relatable to everyone.
Yes.
In terms of Audre Lorde, it's more relatable to a broader sense in terms of people who understand that oppression, that systemically they don't have the leeway to really gut what they want to say out. And that's why we have modern day artists like J. Cole and Kendrick Lamar who literally voice out their opinions, and yet they're shined about being these such talented artists, but yet the problems that they're always talking about and trying to
Those
voice out
aren't
and
really talked about.
they're not talked about.
They're overlooked. The lyrics are overlooked.
Yes.
The lyrics are overlooked, and then you have, once again, performative activists who, they get together and they don't really do much off of it. So while this time there is a head kind of trying to lead the charge, people don't necessarily understand how to interpret poetry and use it properly, which is, once again, a really big thing that I think Lorde is trying to push here.
For sure. And like I remember even seeing like those the protests back in 2020 and like seeing everybody, or not even everybody, because there were people at my high school that definitely did not even agree with the protest. But there were people that were just like, oh, post a black screen on a Tuesday.
Yeah.
And then that's going
Like,
to
you don't know
that's
the
how somehow
meaning.
going to stop racism. Like, no, that's not how it works. We need more action. We need
Yeah.
more things to change institutionally and systemically, because black people are oppressed. We're seeing it. It's literally in our faces now with phones and everything. Like,
I
we see
think,
the oppression
Like,
firsthand.
the biggest issue with that is that people do it more so because it's trendy.
And that's
Yeah.
the problem. That's why Audre Lorde's like, we have to like bring this stuff to light. And even though it might be ugly, it might be like
It's the
hard.
truth.
It's
We
the
need to
truth.
deal
It's
with it.
it's what we're seeing.
Yeah.
And we don't need this performative action. We need like she would always talk about. I'm trying to find that quote actually, where she's talking about not really having reactionary, but it's more radicalized ideas in her poetry, and it's like it's a more accepted.
Yes.
It doesn't sound as radical when she says it through poetry,
Yeah.
and that's why she uses poetry, because that radicalism isn't really accepted if you say it out, like let's say like a presidential like speech or something. Those radical ideas are not going to stick with anyone.
Yeah.
But you say it through poetry, it's a little bit more accepted. Like, why would you say that? How, like, it's a lot deeper than just saying it at, like, a speech or something.
Yeah.
And just just to go on the same, just for people to know that quote, she means she says, right now I can name at least 10 ideas I would have once found intolerable and incomprehensible and frightening, except as they came after dreams and poems. This is not ideal fantasy, but the true meaning, it feels right to me. We can train ourselves to respect our feeling and to discipline, transpose them into a language that matches those feelings so they can be shared.
So, that was big, bro.
Yeah.
Another thing she quotes in the story is that the white fathers told us, I think, therefore I am, and the black mothers in each of us, the poet, whispers in our dreams, I feel, therefore I can be free. So the way she kind of phrases that makes you think, the white poets, or the more mainstream poets kind of write just to write, like, oh, this is cool, this is just a poem. But the black poetry, the poetry that she's writing, explains that this is what she feels, and thus she can be free. So a really good way of kind of like explaining that a little bit better is by looking at her other poem, Coal, that she wrote in 1970. She said, some words live in my throat, breeding like adders. Others know sun, seeking like gypsies over my tongue, to explode through my lips like young sparrows bursting from shell. Some words bedevil me. And the thing she's talking about is that the words that she contains in her throat, the words that she can't really speak about out loud, they're intrusive thoughts to that society that she's been put into. So she says breeding like adders, and it's a demonic kind of snake that they kind of consider over where, you find an adder. But those thoughts continuously breed, and that she uses her poetry, as she said, to kind of use this as an outlet to allow herself to actually speak. And another thing is the term coal. It's something that you put pressure on to actually end up like a diamond, like Luis mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and I think also the fact that she used the symbol of a black mother in terms of using, like, being a poet. And then she says also as a black mother. And, like, obviously we learned a lot of lessons from our own moms, like, of how to act, how to treat ourselves, but also how to navigate, like, these social issues that we deal with. Also, like, we've also had those conversations with our parents, like, you're black, you can't be doing this. Like, you have to be a lot more socially aware of, like, your surroundings. And it's like that black mother, that black poet, like she said, is, like, teaching those lessons to us and, like,
100%.
understanding. Yeah.
100%.
But no, yeah. And I also, like, when I was also reading back to my one poem, that one part of her essay, actually, in the Poetry is Not a Luxury, when she talks about, when we leave our non-European view and we go back to our own, like, ancient, living and being black, I went back to her one poem, Power, in 1976. Actually, no, not Power. It was back to Coal, actually. When she talks about, at the end of the poem, love is a word, another kind of open. As a diamond comes into a knot of flame, I am black because I come from the earth's inside. Take my word for jewel in your open light. And I think that goes back to, like, her, like, going back into the earth to find your roots, to find your power, your true sense of power, because you're always going to find everything in your roots. And, like, that, like, brought me back and, like, made me think, like, reflect on my own, like, home situation, at least in terms of my Mexican side. Like, there's so much ancient knowledge that our family holds, at least in terms of like our ancestors and like what they carry on and what they taught us, and finding that knowledge is power. That knowledge of knowing who you come from and knowing what your traditions are is a very powerful thing, and that culture that maybe some lack because of the African diaspora that we've all had to like deal with, having that ancient knowledge to go back to is a very powerful thing in our own people that will again bring unity into our communities.
Yeah. Having that, like, knowing where you came from just sets you, like, it sets you up with a stronger base so you can know, like, where you can say you really came from to support yourself in a way.
Yeah, and to like Audre was talking about the poem being called Cold and turning it into that diamond, putting that pressure, one of the pressures could be, knowledge and like forming that diamond in all of us, in a sense.
But then when it comes to cold, like, I thought, like, when, like, the birth of diamond, it reminded me of the beginning of A Poetry is Not a Luxury. I'll read you a little part of it. It's in the essay. She says, "This is poetry is illumination for through poetry that we give name to those ideas are until the poem, nameless and formless, to be birthed, but already felt." So that I always felt like within all these pressure that we feel, which, like, for example, for Cole, like, all this pressure we feel like creates like a deep pit within us that she later on talks about as well. And then from there we create that diamond, that gem, for which is pretty much the essence of poetry. So with that is where we could really put the foundation, the pavement to our road to what we really are trying to say or express in our kind of experience.
Yeah. I also feel like that pressure that she talks about, that's already felt, at least with her poems, like she always talks about, is like those problems that go on in our communities for her being black and being a gay activist and also being a mother of children. And it's like all those problems that she deals with as that pressure. And even though it's not on paper yet or it's not being spoken out, that pressure's already felt. That pressure is going on, whether that's on paper or not. And that's a problem.
It's emotional pressure, like it's building it within you,
Yeah.
But even like, I feel like with the more pressure being created only makes the most beautiful gems,
True.
Like we see, I don't know, like the older diamonds we find are like usually the most valuable because of how unique they really are in a way. So that goes on to her poetry. Like her poetry is really unique, at least to me, because you could tell how long this had been built up within her. So seeing it all come out like this is really showing all angles of how she felt and why she felt this way.
And even to touch on that, it's like a couple paragraphs after the quote that you had just mentioned. It says, "For each of us as women, there's a dark place within where hidden and growing our true spirit rises, beautiful and tough as a chestnut." So I think that does also tie into like both Cole and just having all this pressure on you. There's still something that's like a diamond. It's a diamond in the rough, pretty much.
So I think like the biggest thing that I can definitely take from Audre Lorde is kind of like the way I'm gonna start viewing poetry a lot more differently now. It kind of comes from the place of like where it's coming from, what they're really trying to say, like, kind of like really reflect on the lyrics of the song you hear in the radio a little bit more. Kind of think about like what they're talking about, where it really comes from, and how they're trying to actively fight against the adders breeding in their throats, as she says.
Yeah. At least after reading your essay, it just made me feel like I should really do more research. Of looking in, like Audie was saying, like behind lyrics and stuff like that, behind what's going on in the curtains, because that really tells you like the true story of what's really going on, and why it is that we've come to this point.
Yeah.
It's like a breaking point for most people.
Yeah, and I feel like this essay just did a really like great job of just giving, because I appreciate honesty a lot, and I feel like Audre Lorde is already a very honest poet in her sense, but in this essay, like, it felt even more raw than usual. And I feel like I appreciated that honesty a lot, and in terms of like being able to understand from even her point of view, knowing what she's gone through and stuff, understanding what she tries to push through her essays or through her poems and stuff. And so, like, for me personally, I'm going to take this going into like more of her poems and like understanding how much she meant to the black community, and in terms of how empowering she was to us, even though we might not have felt it at first. Now we have this knowledge, and now we could carry on her purpose, at least for what she did when she was here.
Yeah, I genuinely felt a lot more empowered after reading this, just because I can relate to her in the sense where I'm part Black, I'm a woman, I consider myself to be like a feminist, so I do feel a lot more empowered, and I feel like even though like all these struggles that I'm going through and I have gone through, I'm becoming something much better from it.
Yeah.
So that's what I really took from reading this.
So I think that just about wraps up everything we had to say. Anything else?
Nah, I got nothing else to add.
Thank you guys all for coming in, having a conversation with us. So make sure you tune in next time for our next group of classmates who are also going to be discussing more Black literature.
What? That's how you do it!
First time.
Two men couldn't do it, but a woman could.
Relax.